G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. I want to talk about one of Conference Report's videos, possibly two of them. First one was called Pseudospirituality, and the other one was talking about spirituality. Spirituality, the universal solvent. And of course he's managed to draw a fair bit of comment from people on the atheist side of the debate who suggest that any form of spirituality is obviously pseudo because they don't see that there is anything to the universe but what can be seen and touched and felt and measured. They have a very materialistic view of the universe. In suggesting that spirituality is the universal solvent, I think, Fred, you're coming pretty close to pantheism. Maybe, oh yeah. It depends whether you think that everything has a soul. You know, a tree has a soul or a spirit. Stones have souls or spirits. Insects have souls or spirits, which live for a variable amount of time depending on the particular form of spirituality concerned. But the idea seems to be that, you know, when a coyote dies, the coyote's spirit or soul goes on to the afterlife and joins or is subsumed into the great coyote spirit. And, you know, presumably when there are no more coyotes alive on the earth, then the spirit of the coyote in the afterlife will fade away, not being fed by new souls. Now, as far as I can understand, a pantheist is a lot like a sort of a Chinese or Asian spiritualist. You know, the sort of people who, when they're burying somebody, they'll carry along a whole lot of paper facsimiles of all the things they think that person's going to need in the afterlife. And they'll set fire to paper cars, and paper computers, and paper mobile phones, paper iPods. The whole idea is that the essence or the spirit of the iPod, computer, car, phone goes into the afterlife with the dearly departed so that they're all kitted out when they get there. They've got their stuff. As I understand it, before China was sort of Christianised and nationalised and communised and monetised, there was a great acceptance of the idea that the afterlife was in the same physical space and time as the material world. It's just that you couldn't see the spirits in the afterlife, but these spirits in the afterlife were assumed to hang around living people and influence them to do things, cause things to happen to them, or feed off their energy, depending, again, on the particular variety of spiritualism. Best way I've heard it explained was in Sagittarius Rising by Cecil Lewis, who had been a pilot in the First World War, and after the war he was contracted by Handley Page or Vickers, I think it was Vickers, to fly out to, or take a boat out to China and try to set up an airline in China using Vickers Vimis. Maybe it was Handley Page 0400s. I'm pretty sure it was Vickers Vimis. Long time since I read the book. But the point is, while effervescing with joie de vivre from surviving the First World War unexpectedly, there he was transplanted into a whole different rich tapestry of culture. And one of the things he commented on was that on the river, the captains of the junks were constantly trying to cut across the bows of another junk, because each junk was assumed to trail a cloud of following demons. And if you could cut across the bows of the other junk, then your cloud of demons would be cut off your boat by the sharp prow at the front of the boat, and your demons would become his demons. So they were constantly racing each other and trying to bad-manneredly cut each other off to transfer their trailing cloud of demons. I'd never thought of a religion or a view of the universe that operated quite that way until I read that description. So Fred, when you're talking about pseudo-spirituality, you're basically taking an elitist ethnocentric view, which is that whatever view on spirituality the commentator comes from, that's obviously the real spirituality, and anybody who differs from that is obviously pseudo, and pseudo means fake. So you could say that anybody who's in business as a preacher, stirring up the congregation to donate for their own salary, that would be classed as obviously pseudo-spirituality by anybody who's not engaged in that form of theology, theism, religion, business. That's obviously wrong, isn't it? But to the person who's doing it, they may be fully believing of the idea that they are doing what they think of as God's work. So to them it's not pseudo, to anybody else it is. In the same vein that pseudo-spirituality exists, there's a bloody lot of pseudo-science out there. I seem to remember there was a horribly destructive physicist called Edward Teller, personally responsible for blowing atolls out of the ground with a thing called a hydrogen bomb, a fusion bomb. And he decided that he wanted to make a bit of a foray into pseudoscience, and he teamed up with a couple of science fiction writers, Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle, and he went off and talked to a B-grade movie actor called Ronald Ray Gunn and told him that instead of just noticing that their enemy had launched intercontinental ballistic missiles with multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles and thermonuclear bombs just like Edward Teller had designed on them, instead of NORAD merely noticing that they'd taken off and telling everybody to take cover, if Ronnie Reagan okayed spending billions and billions of dollars on scientific research, I call it pseudo-scientific research, then Eddie Teller, he could design them a satellite that had a hydrogen bomb, like he was good at them, at its core, and it was surrounded by X-ray lasers which needed a hydrogen bomb to power them. And he reckoned he was going to detect the infrared signature of missiles in boost phase as the wicked evil enemy that had to exist in the world, otherwise their life made no sense. As the wicked evil postulated enemy launched aggressive missiles against the sacred excited states, then this satellite in the sky would notice the infrared signature, it would swing its X-ray lasers and track the rising, accelerating missiles moving through the atmosphere, and then the hydrogen bomb would go off, and before it blew the satellite into a cloud of debris to imperil every other satellite in orbit, each one of these laser rods would fire an incredibly powerful X-ray laser which would vaporise the fuel in the tanks of the missile and therefore cause it to explode over the sky of the postulated enemy that had to exist, otherwise Edward Teller's view of the universe made no sense. Total gibberish. But they spent thousands of billions of dollars on Star Wars, and that actually sent the USSR broke trying to compete with Star Wars technology. Because if the Americans were doing it, the Russians had to come up with a countermeasure. Pseudoscience, practiced by one of the most destructive actual scientists on the planet. Yeah? And then you get into the pseudo-atheists, the people who say that they're all in for the evidence, yet if the evidence is that there's a 1 in 300 chance that they're going to lose the roof of their house every year to a thunderstorm, because that's the actual incidence of it happening, they're quite happy to go out and pay homage to the great god Mammon at the premium acceptance division of the insurance company, and they will pay 6 times the risk, like a 50th of the cost of repairing their roof, in order to have a storm and tempest policy, because the fates may think that they deserve some bad luck and they want to insure themselves against the actual odds. And they'll pay 6 times over the odds so that the money can be ready tomorrow just in case they've got the bad luck to do it. And they take that alleged, well, they call it atheism, I call it sort of behavioural pseudo-atheism. They take that to the legislature and they enact laws so that I, for example, who would be quite happy to just pray to the creator of the universe for a safe trip every time I start the engine of my car, and they say that I have to have a blasphemous insurance policy in order to get my car registered and use their road. I'm not allowed to use my theology, I have to use the pseudo-atheists' theology. The people who don't actually believe in the evidence, because they pad the premiums by a factor of 600% so that somebody else can make a profit out of it. Yeah, pseudoscience, pseudo-atheism. The pseudo-spirituality kicks in where you got somebody who goes to a church and they sit up there and they say, oh, we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, of all things seen and unseen. And yet, they donate to the church so it can pay the premiums for an insurance policy for the storm and tempest insurance on the roof of the church. They want to borrow money because their religion says thou shalt not commit usury, and they want to be able to pay the interest on the loan they're not allowed to have according to their religion. So therefore they have to go out and take a bet they've got to die to win. It's called life insurance. And if they can't afford enough life insurance, they'll buy term insurance, which is mathematically constructed never to be enforced when you're dead. And when they're really old and decrepit and they're worried about dying, some arsehole on TV will advertise funeral insurance for old people, and when you get a look at it, the policy is actually an accidental death policy. Now, how many geriatrics die by accident? Fuck all, they die slowly in bed from well-known and well-understood medical causes. Probably 50% of them, or 47% of them, iatrogenic. Too many doctors, too many pills, and the potion's ganged up on them. Yeah, if you want to start raising issues of pseudo-spirituality, you've got to raise issues of pseudoscience and pseudo-atheism. And then recognise that pseudo is an ethnocentric, arrogant, elitist way of describing anybody else's ideas which are labelled speculative. I don't think it's a helpful viewpoint to think that anybody is in a position to say that somebody else is pseudo-anything. Am I a pseudo-intellectual or just an autodidactic hillbilly? I'd say I'm not much of an autodidact because I haven't really taught myself to do too many things, because most of the things I've either heard of them being done, or I've read of them being done, or I've seen movies of them being done. A lot of the stuff I've learnt it from somewhere. There's a few things I've taught myself, but I'm obviously not an actual intellectual because I've never been to a university. I haven't been examined by a recognised qualified board or body who can tick off a little box and say, yep, he knows how to regurgitate what we taught him, therefore he's clever. So I'm not an actual intellectual. Because to be an intellectual, you have to have the democratic recognition of a bunch of other people who are recognised to be intellectuals. And science is very democratic. If a particular scientist, that's anybody who uses the scientific method of problem solving, is not popular, then their data is not recognised. That's why so many professors wind up with Nobel Prizes for work that was done by their assistants. Here again, that would have to be pseudoscience, wouldn't it? Yeah. Getting the kudos when somebody else has done the work. A lot of that goes on. Anyway, that's some of my thoughts on pseudo spirituality, science and atheism. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Hope the porridge tastes good in that bowl, Fred. You know you're supposed to wash it before you actually use it. Ciao.